In this video, sponsored by Archvillain Games' new sci-fi villain line of 3D printing STL files, I'll tell you about washes and wash recipes and when you should use them. Liquid talent. That's what a lot of people call washes. Some companies call them shades, but they're generally known as washes throughout most of the hobby. They are transparent fluids. It's like some sort of medium kind of whatever, transparent. And they have then colored pigment in them as well. And that pigment is usually darker. And they generally go over other paints on your model after those, you've painted those paints on there and they have dried. They're designed to collect in the recesses and the nooks and crannies and darken up those areas, kind of pronouncing the detail in the sculpt. They're also frequently, they darken up the flat areas of the model as well, not just the nooks and crannies. The reason that people sometimes call washes liquid talent is because they usually make your model look better very quickly. Just, normally base-coated models with normal opaque paints and stuff like that, they kind of need something more, right? Washes, like I said, darken up the recesses and also add shadows and all that kind of stuff. But they also hide paint mistakes as well, like colors not exactly touching. You're painting a pouch, on the shirt, and they're different colors, and the two colors don't quite exactly come together with your brush strokes at a very, very tiny level. So you put some wash in between them, and it ties those two colors together, makes them look like they come, just right together. The other thing about washes is they also have a tendency to tie the color palette of the overall model together, the more of it you use. I mean, washes can do all of these things and more. But there's a lot more to washes than just slopping them on and, calling it good. When you first start, that might be the play, right? That might be the pro strat, to just put it all over and let it sink in and everything, and there you go. And you will see a definite increase in quality by just doing that alone. But as you get more into painting, right? You get more into this, then you start to need to think about things like, when should you put the washes on the model? Like which part of the process, right? That kind of thing. And then where should you put the washes on the model, And are there kind of like recipes, concoctions that you can mix together to make your standard normal washes straight out of the pot work better for you in certain situations? Let's do some science. All right, now I'm ready for science here. Usually what I do is I get much of the model painted before I start applying my washes, right? I get the base colors down, which are very frequently opaque, but it might also be contrast colors and stuff like that. But I get all that stuff down pretty much everywhere on the model. And then after all of those colors are dry, I then start putting down my washes. After those washes then are completely dry, I then go back and either dry brush or edge highlight the areas that have got wash over them that need now to have a little bit more highlight, right? They need to get a little bit more contrast. And I don't mean contrast paint, but the difference between light and dark, right? It adds more interest to the model as well. Doing the highlights before the washes doesn't usually work for me. Here's why. Generally, I paint something a color, let's say, silver, and then I cover it in a darker wash, darkening the initial color. And then when you need to go back and highlight that silver, right, you can then just use the same color silver that you started with to highlight it, because the wash darkened it, and now you're just using the same color again, which is lighter than what it is now, right? If you want to do the highlights before the wash, then what you need to do is you need to paint the thing silver, right? And then you need to find a brighter silver to highlight with, and then put the wash all over everything. And then hopefully the highlight will kind of shine through over that transparent wash, right? But frankly, when you do that, then the highlight just won't be as highlighty. So paint most of it, right? Throw on washes and then do highlights. Frequently, like I said, with the initial colors, which you probably still have, on your wet palette from when you first did the base coats, right? But where should you apply these washes, right? That's also an important consideration. Again, when you first start out, you might just put those washes all over your model, armor, cloth, skin, scales, whatever, everything, right? And that's okay. But once you get a little bit more experience painting miniatures, you'll start finding that there's good places to put wash and bad places. Flat or smooth areas with very little detail aren't great places to put washes, kind of like, Space Marine shoulder pads and stuff like that. Unless you're just, trying to darken up the entire thing, right? However, you have to be careful that the washes don't pool in those kind of smooth areas, because especially the GW new washes that they've now based off of their contrast formula, right? Like the ones that came out, I think, late last year. I did a whole video about the new washes and what I think about them, which, spoiler alert, not a fan. Pachow. But there's no problem just putting your washes just in the recesses and the cloth folds and the heavy detail areas if you want. Now here comes the real science stuff. What I've been doing more and more recently is mixing my washes with other fluids, like not Coke Zero or something like that or whatever, but like mediums and thinners and other types of things like that, to get things that mainly aren't so dark, but still give me the effects I'm looking for kind of in the recesses, right? It doesn't stain the flat areas as much, and it just kind of sits in the recesses, but it's not quite as dark there either. The easiest way to test these recipes is frankly just to prime up a bunch of extra minis that you might have, laying around or whatever. Just prime them up in white and then put these kind of wash concoctions that you make up over the minis, let them dry, and then see what you get, right? Because like white is going to show you, it's not necessarily, it's kind of a torture test that you're doing for these things, these concoctions you're making up, because you normally just wouldn't put a wash over direct white, but you can really get a good look at it when you put it over a white miniature. As a control, which I think is a scientific term that I'm probably not using properly, here's the new Agrax Earthshade straight out of the pot, right? It doesn't look good, and frankly, like the less said about it, the better, right? Now, to swing the other way, let's do something very, very light and subtle, but still use the Agrax. We're going to take 5 drops of Agrax Earthshade, 5 drops of water, and 10 drops of Games Workshop's Contrast Medium. Mix it all up. This goes on very, very smoothly, but it barely looks like anything when it's dry, right? It's barely there. It could work well for like shading white armor, like stormtroopers or maybe white scars, perhaps. Then to darken things up a little bit more, I made another recipe, which was in this situation 4 drops of Agrax Earthshade and 5 drops of Contrast Medium. No water this time. This made a lighter wash than just obviously regular Earthshade, of course, but it did also very much smooth out like the glops and stuff, which is a scientific term, but like it smoothed out the glops that collected, especially in the flatter areas and stuff like that, right? But it still went into the nooks and crannies and darkened up and added detail there pretty well, I think. I wouldn't use this probably over skin tones much, unless they're much darker skin than say like someone like me. But it works pretty well otherwise on like cloth and armor areas. Since I had more white primed Space Marines to test on, I started with another of my favorite paint lines, Monument Hobbies. I used their brown wash, no recipe at all, pretty much just straight out of the pot, and I found 2 really interesting things. Number 1, it's a cooler brown in comparison to being a warmer brown. Most browns you think of as warm. This brown is a very interesting shade. I almost feel like it's maybe got a touch of purple in it, which makes it very different than other kinds of washes, which is very interesting. And it doesn't stain the flat, smooth areas nearly as much as some of the other ones, and it does still collect nicely in the recesses. In this situation, I ended up using it on the gunmetals that these guys were holding and on the helmet on the guy with the big honking shield, and it gave, I think, a very interesting metal tone. Then I really wanted to make a warmer brown wash that wasn't quite so cool, but with the same properties as the Monument Hobbies wash, the previous one. So I just mixed 1 drop of Monument Hobbies transparent brown, which a lot of people ask, is this a contrast? It's not. It's a totally different thing, but they have a whole line of transparent paints that you might want to take a look at. 1 drop, which is very, very high pigment, of transparent brown with 8 drops of the Monument Hobbies brown wash. And this made, I think, a great color that, again, it doesn't really stain the flat areas as much, but it's still collected nicely in all the recesses and all that kind of stuff. And I ended up using this on the chest armor on both guys and the cloth parts, here and there, especially in the folds and stuff like that. And then all over that big shield that the one guy is carrying. And it really kind of adds like an interesting sort of rust look specifically over that silver on that shield. I used a bunch of techniques from my older weathering video, Pachow, as I was working on it, where you kind of put a layer on, you let it start to dry, and then you go back in and stipple some and all that kind of stuff. But check out that video. It's a good one. And as I said before, after the wash steps were done and dry, it's very, very important to let them dry, I then went in and did the final detailing, predominantly highlighting the metal edges with the original silver on the armor parts and on the big shield, and doing a few cloth highlights as well on some of those parts. And then even some final opaque paint details here and there just to touch up certain things. These models probably have at least 3 or 4 different washes on them used in different places. And I think that that's something important too. Using more than just one color of wash on the model will really help the model look more interesting and less like it was slopped in wash. It makes different metals look different even though the silver is the same color underneath. It makes clothes look different. It makes skin tones look different. If you use just one color wash on the whole model, even if you don't just slop it everywhere, but you only use it, sparingly here and there, it doesn't look as good. I hope that this helps you to get better with washes on your models. And I also hope that you use a few of these recipe ideas that I've given you here as kind of a jumping off point, right? And start doing your own science as well. You don't have to have a, lab coat if you don't want to, but they're pretty cool and not very expensive. If you have any wash recipes that you swear by, right, drop them down in the comments below so that we can all benefit from, your research. And if you liked this kind of content, hit like and subscribe down below for more to come. It really does help. I also want to thank the sponsor of this video, Archvillain Games. They provided the 3D printed Morior Invictus models that I used in this video, which I think that they're awesome. That's why I wanted to paint them. You probably know Archvillain for the amazing line of fantasy STLs that they've been providing for years through their Patreon and in places like My Mini Factory and others. But now they're getting into science fiction models made specifically for wargaming with their sci-fi villain line. Subscribe to their sci-fi villain tier on Patreon, links down below in the description, and get new releases each month. This month is 29 different models, and you'll also get their Star Vault pack as an add-on, which has like 9 pieces of terrain, 5 explorer models, and a dragon. Check out these models and all the rest from the Dead Men Brigade models in March, and prepare for all of the other new sci-fi models they'll be releasing each month on Patreon, and then on My Mini Factory after that. Thanks to Archvillain Games for sponsoring this video, and thanks for watching.